The surgical light was dying. It flickered once, held, flickered again, then steadied into a pale and trembling glow above the operating table at Forward Operating Base Salerno. The generator outside was fighting the Afghan winter the way it fought every night, badly, stubbornly, without resolution. Nobody fixed it. There were worse problems at 3:47 in the morning. The doors came open hard. Two soldiers carried her in on a stretcher, moving at the particular speed of men who have already spent the last of their patience on the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. Dr. William Pierce turned from the supply cabinet and went still. Behind him, a corpsman named Jackson took one look at what had just come through the door and stepped back without meaning to. She was small. That was the first thing. Small and pale and covered in blood that had gone dark in the mountain cold. Her clothing torn in 9 different places. Her left arm bound with a strip of cloth soaked completely through. Her right leg carried a tourniquet made from a bootlace, pulled tight enough to show bone-white skin above the knot. Her face was crusted with blood from a wound along her left temple that had bled heavily and then stopped, sealed by cold and exhaustion into something that looked worse than it was. Pierce counted 9 entry wounds before he touched her. He had been a surgeon for 14 years, 2 combat deployments before this one. He had seen things that no vocabulary he possessed could fully describe, not even to himself at 2 in the morning when those things came back with the clarity that darkness gives to difficult memories. He stood for 3 full seconds without moving because the number he had reached did not correspond to the fact of her chest still rising and falling. Then she opened her eyes, gray, clear, completely focused, like someone who had not been unconscious at all, but had simply been waiting for a reason to come back. She looked at Pierce. Her cracked lips moved. He leaned down. Her voice came in a dry rasp, barely above a whisper, but each word was exact. A set of grid coordinates, spoken in the correct format, a number, 37, a location, Coast Province, a day, Thursday. Pierce straightened slowly. He looked at Jackson. Jackson looked back with the expression of a man trying to reconcile 2 things that would not reconcile. The woman on the table closed her eyes. Her hands at her sides were completely still. One of the soldiers who had carried her in would tell this story for years afterward, and he always ended it the same way. He would say that in 10 years of service, he had never been afraid of someone in a hospital bed. He would say he did not know what he had seen that morning. And then he would say she didn't come back because someone saved her. She came back because she decided to. To understand what that means, you have to go back 3 days. 72 hours earlier, the briefing room at FOB Salerno smelled like burnt coffee and damp gear. Small room, 6 folding chairs around a plywood table. A map of Coast Province pinned to the wall with its corners lifting in the dry air. 1 overhead light that worked and 1 that didn't. The kind of room where decisions were made that would never appear in any official document, made by men who had learned long ago that most of the important work happened in rooms exactly like this one. 5 men were already seated when the door opened. Chief Warrant Officer Nathaniel Drake sat at the head of the table. 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face shaped by years of places like this. Places where the wind was wrong and the dust got into everything, and sleep was something you took in pieces rather than stretches. He had led teams through Fallujah and Ramadi and 3 other locations whose names remain classified. And he ran his operations the same way he had always run them. Tight, controlled, and with a margin of error he kept as close to 0 as experience could push it. He did not like unverified personnel. He had specific reasons for that. In Mosul, 2005, a combat medic attached to his team had frozen at the wrong moment. 18 seconds of paralysis in a doorway. One of Drake's men had bled out on a street corner before anyone reached him. The medic had been well-trained and well-evaluated and had simply broken when the actual moment arrived, because training and the moment are different things. and some people do not discover the difference until it is too late to matter. Drake had not fully trusted a medic assignment since. To his left sat Master Sergeant Vincent Caldwell, 48, with the quiet and deliberate manner of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in any room. He spoke rarely in briefings. He listened instead, and what he noticed tended to be what no one else had thought to look for. Across the table, Sergeant Derek Hollis sat with his arms crossed and his chair tilted back. 33, aggressive in the way certain men stay aggressive past the age when it serves them, because it had worked often enough that they never found a reason to develop a second gear. He was skilled, and he knew it, and he wore that knowledge openly. Stanbull, Connor Hale, and Marcus Webb completed the group. Hale was methodical, careful. 4 deployments without a serious wound, which in his experience meant his luck was either exceptional or building toward a reckoning. Webb was 29, built for the work, and possessed of the quality that experienced operators recognized immediately. He listened to the right people, even when he was not yet certain who the right people were. The door opened. She came in with a field medical bag over one shoulder and a manila folder in her other hand. 5'4", perhaps 118 pounds, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large. Her hair was auburn and pulled back tightly. Her eyes moved once around the room in a sweep that registered everything and displayed nothing. She set the bag down beside the empty chair and the folder on the table and sat without introducing herself. Drake looked at her. She looked back at him. She did not smile or appear nervous. She waited with the flat patience of someone accustomed to not being welcomed and who had decided to be present anyway. Hollis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked at Drake, then at Caldwell, then back. When neither responded to his expression, he let out a slow breath and said, barely lowering his voice, "They sent us a girl." The words sat in the air. Catherine Morrison opened her folder and reviewed the first page of the briefing document. Her expression did not change. Drake said nothing, but he was watching her. Something in the way she absorbed the statement, not with resentment, not with performance, simply with the flat steadiness of a person who had been navigating this particular obstacle since the first day she put on a uniform, registered in the back of his mind. He filed it. He would return to it. The briefing began. The mission was classified at compartmented level. Target, a safe house in the Coast Mountain Corridor, built into a fold of terrain that defeated aerial surveillance and made ground approach dangerous. Intelligence assessed a Taliban command cluster was using the location to coordinate a strike on coalition supply lines through Kandahar. The action window was narrow. Approach conditions were poor. Temperature at elevation was running below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with northwest wind that would complicate any technical work at distance. Morrison's official role was medical coverage. Civilian contractor, CIA support program. She would not breach the structure, would not conduct any engagement. Trauma triage at the extraction point and en route. Hollis asked whether they could simply leave the medical slot empty. Drake told him to read the operations order. Caldwell said nothing, but his eyes moved to Morrison's hands, resting flat on the table, and he held that observation for a moment before letting it go. Something about the way they rested, not loose, not tense, but positioned the way a craftsman's hands rest near tools they know well, stayed with him. The briefing ended. The room cleared. Morrison picked up her bag and her folder and walked out last. Nobody held the door. 40 minutes before departure, Kate Morrison walked to the far side of the motor pool where the vehicles were staged. A single sodium light burned above the fuel depot. The rest was shadow. Someone had left an M4A1 carbine leaning against the wheel of the second truck. She picked it up, cleared the chamber, checked the magazine, confirmed the safety. She indexed her finger flat along the receiver outside the trigger guard. She set it back against the wheel, exactly as she had found it. 4 seconds total. She did not know that Drake had been watching from the operations building doorway, 20 meters away. She did not know he stood there another full minute after she walked away, looking at the space she had occupied, turning something over. He had run operations for 18 years. He had developed the ability to distinguish between people who had been trained to handle weapons and people who had been formed by them. Training was visible. It showed in the deliberate recall of sequence, the small hesitations of conscious memory. Formation was invisible, expressed in the absence of thought, the body knowing without asking. What he had just watched was the second type. He returned inside and said nothing, but in the final equipment check before the 0400 departure, he positioned Morrison in the second vehicle rather than the third. A small adjustment, no explanation. Sometimes in 18 years of work, information arrived in forms that resisted categorization and still demanded response. They moved before dawn, 4 vehicles running dark, north along a route that armies had used for 3,000 years. The Hindu Kush rose on both sides in the black air, massive and indifferent. The road was barely a road, more the memory of one, worn into the earth by animals and men, and the human insistence on going somewhere, regardless of conditions. Kate rode in the second vehicle, between Caldwell and Hale. She did not sleep. She looked out at the darkness and the stars, which at this altitude were startlingly clear, and she held her medical bag in her lap. An hour into the drive, Hale shifted and exhaled slowly. Caldwell heard it. He looked at Hale with the attention of a man who reads bodies the way others read faces. Wrong color. Breathing shallow in a way that had nothing to do with altitude adjustment. He blinked too many times, then appeared to forget to blink at all. When Caldwell put a hand on his arm, Hale turned with a response that was a half-second too slow. Kate was already moving. She had been listening to his breathing for 20 minutes. Not consciously, not as a decision, but because listening was what her training had made automatic. The way certain things become involuntary when you have practiced them long enough that the practice disappears into the body. She said, "Stop the vehicle." The driver looked at Drake. Drake said, "Keep moving." Kate said, "He has air accumulating in his chest cavity. Trachea is beginning to shift. 4 minutes before obstructive shock. After that, 90 seconds before the situation changes permanently." No drama, no elevation in her voice. The tone of someone reciting a measurement. Drake turned and looked at Hale, then at Kate, then at Hale. "Stop," he said. All 4 vehicles stopped on the mountain road, in the dark, in the cold. Kate was out of her door before the vehicle finished moving. Pack open on the ground, gloves on. Caldwell positioned himself with a red lens flashlight without being asked. Tension pneumothorax. Air accumulating under pressure in the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, displacing the heart. Not rare in men who carried heavy loads through rough terrain, with old impact injuries they had never fully disclosed. Almost universally missed in the field until too late. She located the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line with 2 fingers, feeling through fabric and cold with the precision of hands that had done this in darkness before. 14-gauge needle from her kit. She placed it. The hiss of released pressure was small. Clean. Hale breathed. Color returned to his face over 30 seconds. He looked at Kate with the expression of someone who has discovered a gap between expectation and reality that he does not yet have words for. Drake stood 5 feet away with his arms at his sides and watched all of it. Hollis, beside the lead vehicle, had seen everything. He looked at the ground and said to no one in particular, "Could have been something." Caldwell, without turning around, "It wasn't." They returned to the vehicles. Caldwell settled back beside Kate, who was repacking her bag in the red light. Every item returned to its exact position. He watched her hands briefly, then said, quietly enough for only her, "Good catch, Doc." 2 words, but said in the register of one professional acknowledging another. Not as reward or compliment. She did not look up. She finished packing, but the set of her jaw shifted fractionally, and Caldwell noticed. He had served 26 years. He had learned to identify the genuine article early because identifying it early was the difference between decisions that held and decisions that didn't. He had seen it tonight in 4 minutes on a mountain road. He kept that assessment to himself. There would be time. They established a staging position 3 kilometers from the objective as the sky began to lighten. Color came up over the Suleiman Range in layers, dark gray first, then a violet that seemed almost warm against the black it replaced, then a band of deep orange that had no business being as beautiful as it was in a place this cold and hard. No one mentioned it. Most of them looked at it. Men who have spent enough time in places like this one develop the habit of noticing accidental beauty because experience has taught them it is not promised. Kate sat apart, back against a boulder, medical bag between her feet. She carried a photograph in her chest pocket. She did not take it out. She knew it well enough. A man standing at a wooden fence line in late autumn light, Montana pines behind him, holding a rifle in the crook of his arm with the ease of a posture that had become as natural as standing. Gray at his temples, a face shaped by years outdoors and years thinking, and a long time spent refusing to separate those two activities. His name was Garrett Morrison. She had called him Grandpa. The men who had served with him in the western Iraqi desert in January 1991 had called him Hawkeye. Not after the television character, but after what he could do at distance with a rifle and sufficient patience, which was a quality he possessed in quantities that most people simply do not carry in their bones. Delta Force. And before that, other assignments that did not appear in his service record. Before all of it, a boy from western Montana who had grown up in the kind of silence where you either learn to be alone inside yourself or you never learn anything at all. He had started teaching Kate to shoot when she was 14, not because he planned to, because the day after her father's funeral, she had come to him with nothing in her face. Not grief exactly, more the absence of whatever fills a person. And he had understood that she needed something to be given back, some evidence that skill was possible, that the world contained things that could be learned, that patience and precision and effort could produce results that held. He had taken her out to the fence line with the Remington 700 that had been her father's, and placed it in her hands and said simply, "This is not for killing. This is for understanding distance." She had not known what that meant then. She understood it now, in the way you understand things that were true before you had the experience to verify them. Desert Storm, January 1991, Basra Highway. The stories the men told, when they told them at all, had a quality of myth to them. Garrett Morrison, at 56 years old, a senior operator in a unit that did not officially exist, making a shot at 1,400 meters that ended an Iraqi officer's command before the officer knew the command was over. The wind had been wrong. The distance had been impossible. Garrett had made the shot anyway because impossible was a word other people used. He had taught Kate everything he knew, not the mythology, the mechanics, the breathing, the patience, the way you stopped thinking about where the bullet was going and started thinking about where your body was and what your body was doing, and whether your body was still enough to let the rifle do what the rifle already knew how to do. And he had taught her something else, though he had never named it directly. He had taught her that some things you carry alone, that there are distances you have to cross by yourself, that no one can do it for you, and the people who love you know this, and they prepare you anyway, and then they let you go. She thought about that now, sitting against the boulder in the thin dawn light, 3 kilometers from a building where men were planning to kill people she would never meet on a road she would never see. She thought about Garrett at the fence line, his hands on the rifle, his voice steady and calm. This is not for killing. This is for understanding distance. She understood. Caldwell sat 15 feet away, positioned with a view of the valley below and the approach routes they would use when the sun was higher. He was not looking at the valley. He was looking at Kate Morrison's right hand, resting on her thigh. Her index finger was tapping, slowly, rhythmically, not with impatience, with something else, an internal calibration, steady and unconscious, the way a musician marks time when no one is watching. He had seen that particular habit before in men who spent their professional lives measuring distance. The body running its calculations while the conscious mind appeared to rest. The muscle memory of a specific and specialized skill surfacing in the quiet. He thought, I know what that is. He did not say anything yet, but he was fully paying attention now, in the way he paid attention to things that were going to matter before he knew exactly why. The valley below was cold and still and offered nothing away. 20 hours to mission launch. The day was beginning. The safe house did not look like a place where plans were made to kill people. Low and brown, built from the earth around it, consolidated from the landscape over time rather than constructed against it. Mud brick walls, flat roof with a low parapet, 2 shuttered windows facing the approach road, a wooden door standing slightly ajar, in the way of doors in places where privacy carries different weight. Kate came in from the south, along a route established 3 weeks earlier through a CIA support network. She wore locally sourced clothing, a dark green hijab covering her hair and the lower part of her face. She carried a covered basket. Her eyes were the wrong color for the region. In the low winter light, with her face partially covered and her posture calibrated toward the unhurried purposefulness of a woman who had walked this road many times, she did not expect the wrong color to be looked for. She had been right about that before. 2 men near the entrance watched her pass without interest. She went in through the side door, which the network contact had confirmed would be accessible. 4 seconds for her eyes to adjust. She kept moving during those 4 seconds, heading toward the far wall where a woman sat near a small fire, which gave her a direction and a reason and covered the adjustment. 8 men in the main room. She counted without appearing to count, looking at everything except the thing being counted. 2 visibly armed, AK pattern rifles, slung rather than held, which told her something about their confidence in the location's security and how long they had been using it. The table in the center held a kerosene lamp, 2 glasses of tea, and an open notebook. She did not go to the table. She went to the fire. She spoke to the woman in the Pashto she had been building for 14 months. A greeting, a comment about the cold, a question about family, the language of people who share a geography, but her eyes were at the table. The notebook was open to a page of columns, names in Pashto script, grid coordinates in a standard military format, numbers she assessed as a timeline. She read it in the horizontal sweep pattern Garrett had taught her for reading ridgelines. Left to right, top to bottom, returning for anything requiring verification. She made 1 pass, then a second, because the 3rd column was partially obscured by the lamp, and she needed to be certain. She committed everything to the structured memory architecture she had been practicing for 3 years, a system using spatial association and rhythmic encoding to preserve information with the fidelity of a photograph. She had constructed the framework during the walk to the structure, during the 2 minutes outside regulating her breathing and heart rate. 1 item required a 3rd look. Upper right corner of the page, different handwriting, English, a name, American, and beside it, a frequency code. She recognized the name. She held it for 1 second, no longer, then placed it in the framework and moved on. She spent 19 more minutes in the room. She drank tea. She spoke 4 more times to the woman at the fire. She was ready to leave at 18 minutes and waited until 22 because leaving early was its own signal. When she moved toward the door, none of the 8 men looked at her with more than ordinary attention. Outside, the cold hit her face. She breathed it slowly and deliberately. She turned north, toward the alley that led to the extraction point. Her earpiece, a device smaller than a shirt button, seated in her left ear canal, carried Drake's voice. Exiting, moving to extraction. Copy, 7 minutes. She walked. The alley was narrow, mud brick left, grain storage right. packed dirt floor with a shallow drainage channel. At this hour, in this cold, it should have been empty. 40 seconds in, she noticed the quality of the silence. Wrong kind. Not the silence of a place where nothing was happening, but the silence of a place where ordinary noise had been removed. The dogs that were always somewhere in settlements like this one were not audible, gone to ground, disturbed earlier. And beneath the silence, barely there, the specific human sound of people holding their breath. She stopped. 3 seconds. She listened. She turned left, through a gap in the wall she had noted on approach, moving at the same pace, purposeful, unhurried, into a narrow, connecting passage between two structures. Through it, turning north, adjusting her route, she was 15 meters down the connecting passage when the alley she had left erupted. Automatic weapons fire in an enclosed space eliminates the possibility of other sounds. It fills every frequency simultaneously. She pressed against the wall and held for 4 seconds, long enough to understand the fire was not directed at her. Then moved before any new position could be established. Drake in her ear. "Sit rep, where are you?" "Alternate route compromised." A pause. How compromised? She thought about who had known the extraction route. 6 people, all cleared, all with operational reasons. She thought about the briefing 3 weeks ago in Kabul. Colonel Brennan leaning across his desk, hands folded, voice calm. She thought about his eyes, which she had noticed and set aside because she had trusted the man, and trust edits what the eyes report. She thought, it was Brennan. She said, going to high ground, re-establishing contact from elevation. Drake, negative, return to. She turned the signal off. A small switch inside her collar. The decision took no time at all. The extraction route had been given to Brennan. The men in the alley had known exactly when she was coming, in exactly which direction. The instructions to return to extraction were instructions to return to the people who had just tried to kill her. Garrett, without ever naming it, had taught her this principle through the stories he told on the porch. Stories about moments when the correct choice looked wrong from outside and was only made by people who had learned to trust a specific internal signal. He had called it clarity under pressure. He had said it was rare and could not be manufactured, only recognized. She ran. The first bullet caught her left shoulder 40 meters from the settlement edge. Not the impact first, the rotation. Her body torquing left and down, involuntarily, her feet compensating and failing. The shoulder went numb in the way serious injuries sometimes do before they become serious. She stumbled, regained stride in 3 steps, and did not stop. She ran toward the mountain. They followed for 400 meters. In that 400 meters, she was hit 3 more times. The second round took her right forearm, through muscle, bone intact. The third went through her left side below the last rib, and she categorized the pain and set it aside. The fourth opened her left calf and pulled at her stride without stopping it. 4. She kept the count running and kept running. At the base of the first rock shelf, she found cover behind a boulder and turned. 2 men were 40 meters below her on the slope, moving with the confidence of people who believed she had nowhere to go. She let them come to 25 meters. She threw a rock to her left. When the nearer man turned toward the sound, she was already moving. The north face of the rock shelf was steep but climbable. Her right hand did most of the work. Her left arm contributed what it could, which was less than she needed and more than nothing. She went up alone, using the gaps in the stone that erosion and time had provided, and she did not think about the men below, or the bullets in her body, or the cold that was beginning to make itself known in ways that would matter soon. She thought about the next handhold, the next place to put her weight, the next move that would take her higher. At the top, she found him, a spotter positioned to direct the men below rather than engage independently. He had a Soviet-era Dragunov SVD trained on the valley, and he was tracking through it when Kate came over the shelf from the north, from the angle he had not covered because the north approach required climbing, and he had judged it too exposed for anyone in her condition to attempt. He had judged incorrectly. She used the rock face and the seconds of surprise that the wrong angle gave her, and the efficiency that Garrett had spent 5 years building into her, the kind of close quarters work he had called practical, which she understood later was the kind of practical developed by people who had done it in places where being slow meant being dead. It was over quickly. She did not think about it during, and she would not think about it after. There was only the action and the completion of the action, and then the next thing that needed doing. She checked the Dragunov. The action was worn, and she did not trust it zero. She looked at what else was available. His secondary weapon was an M24 SWS in a battered but serviceable case, still strapped to his pack frame. American manufacture, Leupold Mark V in a fixed mount. A zero she could read from the adjustment marks. Someone had supplied this Overwatch position with American precision equipment. She filed that alongside the name in the upper right corner of the notebook and picked up the M24. She had 2 minutes before the men below noticed the spotter had gone silent. She used them to find a position on the western slope, behind a shelf that gave her left-right cover and required anyone engaging her to thread a gap. The men on the lower slope were regrouping. The Dragunov fire had stopped, and they were trying to understand what that meant. Then Vincent Caldwell's voice came through the earpiece she had not turned back on. She realized it had reconnected automatically when she came around the north face of the shelf, back within range of the team's signal. His voice was compressed, near the edge of control. "Sniper, northeast ridge. He has the overwatch point. Hale is down." She understood the geometry instantly. The overwatch shelf where Caldwell and Hale had been positioned was exposed to a prepared position on the ridge above. If that position was occupied, the overwatch team was completely visible. Drake's voice. "Anyone have a shot? Anyone have the angle?" Silence. Caldwell. "Negative. Pinned down. Hale took one in the femoral area. Tourniquet applied. We need extraction inside 15 minutes. Drake. "Hollis? Webb? Can either of you?" Hollis. "Negative. No angle from our position." The silence that followed had a specific texture. The texture of a situation that has exhausted its expected options and is waiting for something outside its framework. Kate looked northeast. She was above the overwatch shelf by approximately 40 meters due to her climb. The ridge where the enemy sniper was working ran northeast at roughly her elevation, offset by the angle of his shots and the sound in the visible terrain. She calculated the distance, 740 meters. She settled behind the shelf, checked the M24 magazine. 4 rounds remaining, 1 in the chamber. 2 had been expended by the spotter before she arrived. She verified the zero from the Leupold's adjustment marks. She found the ridge in the optic. He was in a natural depression, left and right cover. A narrow gap she would need to thread. He was firing at regular intervals, unhurried, believing his position secure. He had not looked in her direction. She controlled her breathing. 4 seconds in. 7 held. 8 out. Once. Twice. She let her heart rate settle. Wind. Northwest. 12 knots. Based on debris movement at the base of the ridge. At 740 meters, 12 knots from the northwest would push the round approximately 16 inches right of point of aim. She held left. She adjusted for bullet drop at this elevation. The air was thin and cold and behaved differently than at sea level. She held the reticle high to compensate for what she calculated as 30 inches of drop. She held the picture. 1 more breath cycle. She squeezed at the bottom of the exhale, between heartbeats, in the interval Garrett had told her was the only interval that mattered. The shot broke. She watched through the optic and saw the impact. 12 inches right of the target. Wind correction had been fractionally low, or her hold had drifted slightly. Both possible. Either way, the missed distance was clear, and the adjustment was straightforward. The man on the ridge dropped into his depression, and she heard Caldwell's voice cut off mid-sentence. She increased her left hold by 4 minutes of angle. She waited. He showed again, scanning, not yet sure where the shot had come from. She fired. The ridge went quiet. The steady fire from the northeast stopped completely. The silence it left was not the silence of a pause, but the silence of a conclusion. Caldwell, after a moment in a voice that carried something she recognized as a man recalibrating, "Target down. Ridge is clear. Who has that shot?" Drake. "Hollis?" Hollis. "Negative." Webb. "Not me." The silence came back, a different kind. The kind that arrives when something has happened outside all available categories. Kate kept her eye on the optic for another 10 seconds, scanning for secondary positions. Then she said into the earpiece she had reconnected, "Catherine Morrison, northwest elevation, coming down." Nobody answered for a moment. Drake, carefully, "Copy." She came down in 5 minutes and crossed to the overwatch shelf where Caldwell was working on Hale, who was pale but breathing correctly and watching her approach with an expression she could not read. Drake had covered ground from the south that should have taken 15 minutes and had eaten it in 8. He was breathing hard and not showing it. He looked at her. She looked back. "How far?" 740, approximately. "You missed the first shot. Wind correction was off 4 minutes. I adjusted." He held that for a moment. Not the arithmetic of it, but what the arithmetic implied. What it meant about the shot. What it meant about the person who had made it. "Your grandfather?" "Yes." "Garrett Morrison?" "Yes." He stood with that for a moment. Around them, Webb and Hollis were running a security perimeter. Caldwell finished dressing Hale's leg and looked up. Something passed between Caldwell and Drake. The conclusion of a conversation that had been building since a mountain road, an hour into the drive. Caldwell said, quiet enough not to carry, "Garrett Morrison is in Brennan's watch file. 3 years. Because Garrett knows something about Brennan's relationship with an Afghan asset named Qasim. Brennan ran him as a CIA source, going back to the Soviet period. Qasim did things for Brennan that aren't in any official record. Garrett was present for some of it. Garrett remembered. The air between them did not move. Drake looked at Kate. He looked at the alley below, where the ambush had been waiting. He looked at the ridge. She was never supposed to come back from this. Caldwell did not answer. The architecture of what had just been established contained its own answer. Brennan had designed the mission. Brennan had provided the extraction route. Brennan had placed Garrett Morrison's granddaughter inside a Taliban network, with information in her head that connected his name to an operation that should not exist. And the alley had been full of men who knew exactly when she was coming. Then the second counterattack came from the west. 4 men, well-positioned, using the ridge line above the western approach to push the team toward the valley floor. A PKM machine gun on the high ground, at elevation. A PKM can suppress a much larger force than the number of men operating it would suggest. Drake directed the team into the rocks. Hollis returned fire. Webb covered the northeast. Caldwell moved Hale. The PKM was at 1,150 meters. High. The operator was shifting to track the team as they relocated. Predictable pattern. Shifting left, firing, shifting back. He was not expecting to be found at that distance, in these conditions. Kate found a position to the south. She settled into it. 1 round in the chamber, 2 in the magazine. Her left shoulder was delivering a continuous signal she was managing by narrowing her focus to what was within her control. She led him by 3 body lengths, added the windage correction from the first shot, adjusted for the longer distance, factored the drop, substantial at over 1,000 meters in thin air. She fired. Through the optics, she saw him go still in the way that is different from every other kind of stillness. The PKM fell silent. The remaining 3 men pressed without the high ground advantage, which was the wrong decision, moving them into terrain that exposed rather than protected them. It did not last long. When it was over, Drake walked to where Kate knelt with the M24 across her knee. He stood above her. He did not speak for a moment. He opened his mouth to say something. Then the shooting came from the south, from a direction that held no Taliban, from a weapon whose report she identified before she felt the impact, because she had been trained on enough platforms to know their voices. The round hit her right side, high, 5.56 by 45 millimeter, NATO specification, the 7th round. The 8th found her left shoulder blade, skipping off the scapula. The 9th opened a channel through the muscle below her right collarbone. She was already going down when the 9th arrived, and the rocks came up fast. She put her left arm out, and her left arm did not do what she asked it to. She hit the ground, face forward. 6 inches from her face, a brass casing. She looked at it. 5.56 NATO, American ammunition. She thought, I need to remember that. She thought, I need to get up. She thought with the last organized current of consciousness available to her. FOB Salerno, northeast, 3 miles. The dark arrived. She moved into it and kept moving. She came back from the dark the way you surface from deep water, against resistance, aware of the surface long before you reach it. First, cold. Not the sharp cold of mountain air, but the deeper cold of a long exposure. One that had been working on her for hours and intended to keep its progress. In her hands and feet, in the left side of her face where it had been pressed against the ground. Second, silence. Whatever had been happening when she went under had either ended or moved. She opened her eyes. Afghan morning sky, flat gray, November. She was in the rocks on the western slope. New snow had come down while she was unconscious, a thin skin over everything, covering the brass casing she had last looked at. She conducted a systematic assessment, beginning at her head and working down. 9 entry wounds total. 2 in her left arm, shoulder and forearm. 2 in her right side, high on the rib cage, lateral below the last rib. The tourniquet on her left thigh was still correctly placed. 1 in her right calf, 1 along the left side of her skull, 2 in her back, right side, 1 near the shoulder blade, 1 through the latissimus. All 9 located. She categorized each one by severity, by what was stable and what required immediate attention, and what required attention she could not provide. She was alive. She was cold. She was losing blood from multiple sources in a cold environment at elevation. And she was the only person carrying intact and organized the information that would prevent 37 people from executing a plan that would kill an unknown number of others on a Thursday, now 2 days closer than when she entered that building. She sat up. The pain that came with this was a statement she acknowledged and did not obey. Information, not instruction. Inventory. M24, gone. Sidearm, gone. Medical bag, gone. She had her clothing, a strip of cloth tied around her shoulder, a folding knife, a compass, and the photograph in her chest pocket. She held the compass level until the needle settled. Northeast. FOB Salerno. She stood up anyway. She cut strips from her jacket's inner lining and addressed the wounds she could reach. Shoulder. Forearm. The lateral wounds on her right side with difficulty. The scalp wound she patted and secured with a strip looped under her jaw and over her head. The back wound she packed against her clothing and accepted as outside her control. She tightened the tourniquet. She began to move northeast. Garrett had given her this system without calling it a system. He had simply used it himself on an 8-mile return in bad November conditions when she was 15 and frightened, and he was 60 and had just kept moving, one section at a time, without apparent consideration of the total. She had asked afterward how he kept going. He had said, I didn't think about where I was going. I thought about where my foot was going. She thought about where her foot was going. The first hour was the worst. Her body had not yet reached the accommodation that follows sustained pain, the narrowing of awareness, the specific competence of a system that has committed to its task and stopped arguing. She was aware of everything simultaneously, every wound, every step. The wrongness of the high back wound when she breathed deeply, which she was careful not to do. She spoke quietly to no one. She recited everything from the Safe House notebook. Names, first 7, Pashto, preserved in the memory framework. Grid coordinates, 4 sets. Timeline numbers from the 3rd column. She had verified these on the 2nd pass. They were correct. And the last item, the name in the upper right corner, American, a different hand, a frequency code beside it. She said the name once aloud, into the mountain air. Hearing it in her own voice made it more concrete and more terrible. She filed it back and kept moving. In the 2nd hour, the cold became the primary problem. She tracked it by the quality of her thinking. The content remained organized, but the speed of it was beginning to lag in the specific way of dropping core temperature. She was still shivering, which meant her body was fighting rather than surrendering, which meant she was not yet past the threshold where hypothermia stops being a risk and becomes a fact. She moved faster. Movement generated heat. It raised blood pressure and it aggravated the wound in her thigh, but heat was the more immediate problem. She accepted the trade. In the 3rd hour, she reached a broken ridge that cut directly across her line. She climbed it. Her right hand did the work that 2 hands should have shared. Her left arm contributed what it could, which was less than needed and more than nothing. At the top, she stopped and looked northeast. Not the base itself, not visible at this distance, but the ambient glow of it. The particular illumination that large military installations produce even under light discipline, because large groups of people and machines generate light the way they generate heat, inevitably in quantities that accumulate. It was far. It was there. She climbed down the other side. In the 4th hour, 2 men crossed the terrain 200 meters to her south, moving west. She heard them first and went flat in a shallow depression behind a rock shelf. She lay without moving for 40 minutes while they passed and moved beyond hearing. 40 minutes on frozen ground. She breathed shallowly in the pattern she had practiced until involuntary. She counted at the pace of her heartbeat, and when she reached 1,000, she began reciting the intel again from the beginning. Every name, every coordinate, every number, the American name in the upper right corner, all of it intact. When the men were gone, she stood. Standing from 40 minutes on frozen ground was among the hardest physical acts she had performed. And she did it without sound, and she moved northeast. The 5th and 6th hours blurred, moving. The glow ahead getting closer, then seeming to stop, then resuming. The ground changing from technical mountain terrain to lower approach terrain. She fell twice. First time, up in 8 seconds. Second time, left side, the impact on her shoulder sending a signal she managed by focusing on the sound of her own breathing until it receded enough to assess. Nothing changed that mattered. She got up. In the 7th hour, she stopped thinking about Garrett. Not a decision, simply what happened. He had been with her in some form for the entire journey. Not as a voice, not as a vision, but as a quality of presence. The feeling of being accompanied by someone who has given you everything useful they know and trusts you to use it. In the 7th hour, even that faded. What remained was simpler. The next step, the one after that. The glow to the northeast that was now clearly a set of lights. She was information moving from a location where it could not be used to one where it could. She moved. The 9th hour was the worst for a different reason than the first had been. She had covered most of the distance, and the remaining distance had taken on a quality of impossibility that was entirely psychological, and that she recognized as such, and that felt impossible regardless of the recognition. The last distances are always hardest, not because they are physically harder, but because the body has been given permission to believe it is almost over, and the almost is what breaks people. Garrett had told her this. He called it the last mile problem. He said it claimed more people than all the earlier miles combined. The solution was simple and not easy. You did not allow the concept of almost to exist. There was only the next step. She did not allow almost. In the 11th hour, before the thin winter dawn, she came to the outer perimeter wire of FOB Salerno. She could not stand up reliably. She covered the last 400 meters on her hands and knees, and her elbows when her hands gave out, moving in the flat, determined, graceless fashion of a body that has spent all of its performance and is operating on something that has no name in any medical literature. A voice, young, male, above and ahead. "Hello? Is someone? Who's there?" She lifted her head. A guard post 20 meters ahead. A soldier young enough to show it, even at this distance and in this light, holding his rifle carefully. She looked at him. Coast Safe House, 37 men. She heard him key his radio. Thursday. The convoy hits Thursday. She spoke the coordinates, all 4 sets, precisely, in order, with the correct grid references. The ground came up to meet her face, and she let it come, because she had arrived. And arriving was the only thing that had been required, and she had done it, and the information was intact, and she could afford now to stop. She heard the guard's voice, fractured with something between fear and awe, saying into the radio, "I need a medical team at Post 7. I need a team now." She closed her eyes. She did not lose consciousness immediately. She lay for 2 or 3 minutes in the specific piece of a completed task, aware of the cold and the pain and the sounds of boots coming at a run. And she thought about Garrett at the fence line in the autumn light. And she thought that she understood now what he had meant. Not about the rifle, about the distance. She found out how far she could go. She went under. Dr. Pierce worked for 6 hours. He removed 5 rounds and left 4 in place, because leaving them was safer given their depth and proximity to structures requiring more controlled conditions than a forward operating base surgical suite could provide. He addressed the tension pneumothorax developing in her right lung, a condition she had almost certainly managed herself at some point during the 11 hours, based on evidence he found that he could not otherwise explain. He repaired the femoral area, addressed the vascular damage in her arm, cleaned and closed the scalp wound. When he finished, he stood outside the surgical suite for 4 minutes and looked at the wall. Then he went back in and checked everything again. Kate awoke 18 hours after surgery. Small room, antiseptic, recycled air, a high, narrow window showing pale morning sky. She turned her head. Pierce was in the chair by the door with a document in his hands. She said, "The documents." Her voice was wrong, but the words were clear. He looked up. "Miss Morrison, the documents you brought back, where are they?" "You didn't have any documents when they brought you in." "I know." She raised her right hand and touched 2 fingers to her right temple. "It's here. All of it. I need a recorder and a JAG officer now." He held her in his gaze for a moment, then he stood. Drake came while the NSA analyst was still setting up recording equipment. He stood near the door and looked at her, and she looked at him and neither spoke for a moment. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he set one on the tray beside her bed without asking. He sat in the chair Pierce had been using. "Caldwell said you'd be awake. How's Hale?" "Out of surgery. He'll keep the leg." A pause. "Team is intact." She nodded. The JAG officer arrived, Captain Rebecca Whitmore, 40s, the careful look of a woman woken at an unusual hour for reasons not yet explained. Drake stayed. Kate spoke for 40 minutes. Names first. 7 complete, Pashto preserved exactly as written. Then coordinates. Then the timeline. Then operational details she had assembled from 22 minutes of observation. She spoke at a steady pace with no hesitation and no corrections. The analyst's expression began changing around the 20-minute mark. He stopped typing at one point and simply listened. Then he remembered and caught up. When she came to the final item, she paused. Not because it was difficult to recall, because what it required was different from clinical recitation. It was a statement whose implications had been turning in her mind for 11 hours. She said, "Upper right corner of the page, different handwriting from the rest, an American name and a frequency code." She gave the frequency code first. Then she said the name. The room went still. Drake's posture changed in the small way bodies change when they receive information they were half expecting and find the expectation insufficient. Whitmore looked at the analyst. The analyst looked at his recording equipment with the expression of a man considering the rest of his career. Drake said, "Say it again." She said it again. He stood and walked to the window, the narrow, high window with its pale view of the cost morning, and stood there with his back to the room. Then he turned. "Brennan," he said, not a question, a fact being placed carefully to see if it held its shape. "The frequency code will confirm it. NSA has been monitoring that channel for 8 months. Run it." Drake looked at Whitmore. Whitmore left with her phone already open. Drake looked back at Kate. He said, "Rest. This takes 48 hours to unwind. The convoy is Thursday. I know. We have the coordinates. We have the names." He held her eyes with something that was not warmth exactly, but lived in the same territory, the expression of a man who has revised a position completely and is willing to let the revision show. "We have enough because of you." He left. The analyst gathered his equipment. Whitmore paused at the door, considered whether something needed to be said, and concluded it did not. Kate looked at the ceiling. She thought about Garrett, about what it meant to have been prepared for something without being told, to have received without knowing it was being given everything that would eventually be needed. She had been waiting to feel angry about that, and it had not arrived. What came instead was more complicated, an understanding that included grief about what it meant that he had known, and the recognition that what he had done and what she had survived were not separate things, but parts of a single, continuous act of care expressed in the only language he had ever fully trusted. He had taught her everything he knew. He had trusted it would be enough. It had been enough. She put the coffee down and closed her eyes and slept for 11 hours without dreaming. She woke the second time to voices in the hallway. She lay still and identified them before the door opened. Drake first. She knew his footsteps, the weight of a man who moved as if every surface might need to bear more than his body. A lighter step she placed as Caldwell, then the uneven cadence of someone managing a crutch on a hard floor. The door opened. Drake came in without uniform, which meant this visit was not official. He stood at the foot of her bed and she looked at him, and neither of them found a way to start. He reached into his chest pocket. He placed the patch on the blanket near her right hand. Gold Eagle over Anchor, over Pistol, over Trident. The Naval Special Warfare insignia. Earned through the longest and most demanding selection process in the American military. Worn by men who did not give the symbol away for reasons of sentiment or gesture. He had not said anything. He stepped back and came to attention. Not ceremonial, not rigid, but the quiet and deliberate attention of a man who has decided that a thing deserves to be marked and is marking it. He held it for 3 full seconds. Then he left. Caldwell sat in the chair by the door. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of directness. He said, "I filed the after action through JAG, unofficial support role, Northeast Quadrant, 11 hours. It's on record." She said, "You didn't have to stay." He said, "I know." There was nothing to add to that. He stood and put his hand on the door and paused. He said, "Garrett would have done the same thing. He did, actually, for a man in a bad situation who has never known to this day that anyone was watching." He opened the door. "You come from good stock, Doc." He left. Hollis came in 30 seconds later. He stood in the doorway, not at ease, not physically, not in any other sense. He was a man whose professional identity had been organized around a specific form of competence that had just been comprehensively redefined in front of him. and he had not yet finished deciding who that made him. He looked at the floor. He looked at the trident patch on her blanket. He said, "I was wrong about you. From the first minute." A pause. He was choosing words with visible effort, which was not his natural mode. "That's not something I say. I want you to know I mean it." He did not wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out. And the quality of how he left, without softening the admission, without qualification, was the most honest thing she had heard him say. Hale came in last. He moved on a single crutch, his right leg wrapped from mid-thigh to knee, still getting his color back. He sat in the chair beside her bed with the careful deliberation of someone managing new limitations, put the crutch against the wall, and looked at her. He said, "You got me. In the vehicle. Needle in the chest." "Yes." "I thought you were trying to kill me." "You would have been fine." He shook his head slowly. Pierce confirmed it, 20 minutes, maybe less, before it went critical. He paused. "And then you got the shooter on the ridge while I was down. And I understand now from the debrief, from what Caldwell explained, that you had already been hit at that point." She said nothing. He said, "You saved my life twice, once with a needle and once with a shot I could not have made healthy, stationary, in ideal conditions." He met her eyes. "I will say that to anyone who needs to hear it for as long as it's relevant. That's not gratitude. That's a fact I intend to keep on record." She looked at the trident patch. She said, "How's the leg?" He said, "I'll keep it." She said, "Good." He stood and picked up his crutch. At the door, he paused the way all of them had paused, as if leaving required one more thing that none of the available languages had a form for. He said, "Next mission. If you're on it, I want to be on it." He left. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the light was going, the brief Afghan afternoon giving way to early November dark. Tomorrow, the investigation would enter its next phase. More officials, more debriefs, the long, careful work of converting what she carried in her memory into something the system could act on. She picked up the trident patch. The weight of it sat in her palm like a promise she had not asked for and did not yet know how to carry. She set it on the tray beside the coffee Drake had left, hours ago now, cold, and turned toward the window and let the last of the afternoon light come in. The results came quickly, as these things go, when the intelligence is precise and the people acting on it have been waiting for a thread to pull. 34 members of the Coast Network were taken in the 48 hours following Kate's debrief, 2 more in the following week. The planned attack, 7 men, 2 vehicles, a coalition supply point on Route 1 on a Thursday morning, did not happen. Thursday came and went like any other day, which is the best possible result of this kind of work, and the one that is hardest to point to as evidence of anything, because nothing is the proof of its own prevention. Somewhere on that supply route, soldiers and drivers and engineers who had no way of knowing they had been in danger finished their work and went back to their bases and slept. Qasim was taken at the safe house. He said very little during the initial detention. He asked one question on the first morning, through an interpreter, in a voice that carried no anger and no plea, whether the American woman who had entered the safe house was still alive. When told she was, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said in English, with the accent of a man who learned the language from Americans a very long time ago, "I am glad." Caldwell heard it from the detention team and remembered it. Colonel Richard Brennan was arrested at Kabul Station on that same Thursday. He was in his office when the agents arrived, a cup of coffee on his desk, and he did not appear surprised. As they placed the restraints, he said, "Tell the Morrison girl I'm sorry, not for what I did, for what she had to go through to prove it." He did not say more. Nobody asked him to. The investigation revealed that Brennan had positioned 2 contractors, former military, now private security, on the southern ridge with orders to eliminate Morrison if she made it past the Taliban ambush. They had followed those orders. Both men were taken into custody 6 days later at a safe house in Jalalabad. Neither spoke during interrogation. Neither needed to. The brass casings and the ballistics reports said everything that mattered. The investigation that followed was classified at a level that meant most of the people involved would never speak about it publicly, and the public record would contain a version of events accurate in outline and silent on almost every detail that mattered. This is the nature of this kind of work. The absence of a story is sometimes the story. 6 months later, on a morning in May, when the air at Fort Bragg carried pine and cut grass and the particular cleanliness of a well-maintained installation, Kate Morrison stood at the front of a classroom. 18 people, 4 branches, ages ranging from 22 to 38, selected over 3 months through a process that looked for a combination of qualities that was unusual and specific, clinical competence and physical capability, and the willingness to exist in the space between categories without needing the categories to resolve. The shadows under Kate's eyes had faded. She had gained back 9 of the pounds she had lost. She stood with both things, not one and then the other, not alternating, but both present simultaneously, the way a thing is when it has been tested and found to be what it claimed. On the board behind her, in her own handwriting, Integrated Combat Medicine, Class 01. She looked at the 18 people in front of her. She said, "Both hands. That is what this is about. You can hold a needle and you can hold a rifle, and the same hands do both. Not in sequence, but simultaneously. The same mind holds both." Not as a theory, as a demonstrated fact. She paused. "We are going to spend the next 12 weeks making it yours." Nobody spoke. Several people wrote something down. A young specialist in the second row looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person who has found the right room and knows it. That evening, in her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bunk for a while before dialing. Her mother answered on the second ring. They talked for 22 minutes. Kate said she was fine. She said the shoulder was mostly healed. She said she was teaching. Her mother said, "I hear something different in your voice." Kate said, "Good different or bad different?" A pause. Her mother said, "I think your father would have been proud. I know your grandfather is." Kate looked at the window. Outside, the North Carolina pines were dark against the sky that had a few stars showing through the cloud cover. Fewer than the Hindu Kush mountains had offered. Fewer than that altitude where the universe presents itself with unmediated clarity. But some. Enough. She said, "I know." After she hung up, she sat in the quiet for a while. Then she went to bed and slept the way she had been sleeping for several weeks. Fully, without interruption, with the particular rest that comes to people who have stopped carrying something they had been carrying for a long time. At 5:45 the next morning, she was at the range. The M24 was Garrett's, shipped to her in Germany while she was still in the hospital, in a hard case that arrived with no return address and a single sheet of paper on which was written in his handwriting, "Only yours now." She settled into the prone position. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that makes long-distance shooting honest. Target at 1,000 meters, standard silhouette. The same target she had shot at 1,000 times on the fence line in Montana, in the valley west of Bozeman, on an October afternoon at 16 when Garrett had looked at her grouping and said, without inflection, without anything except the precision she had learned to read as his highest form of approval, "You're consistent." She did not rush. She controlled her breathing. She let her heart rate find its floor. She read the small movements in the ground at mid-distance and accounted for what they told her about the air between her and the target. She thought about what Garrett had told her consistency meant. Not repetition, not mechanical reproduction of a sequence. Consistency meant the principle behind the sequence had been internalized deeply enough that the sequence expressed itself rather than being performed. The knowledge had gone somewhere below knowledge, into the place where things live that you no longer have to think about. She held the picture. She waited. Not passively, not with emptiness, but with the full attention of someone present to every variable in the moment, ready to respond to what the moment actually offered. The moment came. She fired. The round found the center of the silhouette with a precision that was not luck and was not performance. It was the expression of everything given to her and everything she had done with what was given. The long chain connecting a man at a fence line in Montana in the autumn of a year when his granddaughter needed something to be put back into the world, and the person that chain had built across the years, in the tests, in the distances covered. She ran the bolt. She moved the target back to 1,200 meters. No marker, a habit, a way of keeping herself honest. She settled again. Breathing, heart rate, wind. She thought about what Garrett had said when she was 14, and the rifle had been too heavy, and the distance had seemed impossible. And she had looked at him and asked whether she would ever be able to reach that far. He had said, "The distance is always reachable. You just have to stop thinking about the distance and start thinking about the next thing you can control." She thought about the next thing she could control. She fired. The shot broke clean. The silhouette received it in the center, the way targets do, the way the mountain had, the way all the distances she had covered absorbed everything she brought to them and asked her silently to bring more. She lay still for a moment after the second shot. The morning around her was quiet. Light was coming through the scrub brush. Behind her, the installation was beginning its day. Vehicles, voices, the rhythms of a large organization moving from rest toward work. In 4 hours, she would stand in front of 18 people who were going to learn what both hands meant. She broke down the rifle, packed it into Garrett's case, lifted it by the handle, and held it for a moment. Heavier than it looked, the way it had always been, the way things that carried this much history always were. She carried it back across the range in the early light. Behind her, the sun was coming up over Fort Bragg, and ahead of her, 18 people were waiting to learn what she had learned on a mountain in Afghanistan, which was that distance is not the enemy, and fear is not the problem, and the only thing that matters is the next thing you can control. She walked back. She was ready. 3 weeks after she returned to Fort Bragg, a letter arrived. Heavy paper, no return address, postmarked from a town in Montana she recognized. Inside, in handwriting she knew as well as her own, Garrett had written, "Kate, if you are reading this, then you made it back from something I knew you would have to face and was not certain you would survive. I have carried the knowledge of what Brennan is for longer than you have been alive. I have tried to stop him through every official channel I could find, and every channel led back to him or to someone who owed him or to a wall I could not climb. When they asked me to recommend someone for the Coast operation, I knew what it was. I knew who had designed it. I knew what it meant. I recommended you anyway. I do not ask you to forgive this. I do not expect you to understand it, though I think in time you might. What I need you to know is that I did not send you there to die. I sent you there because you were the only person I trusted to survive what surviving it would require, and to carry back what needed to be carried, and to be believed when you said it. You have always been stronger than you knew, stronger than I could tell you, because strength is not something that can be given. It can only be discovered. And discovery requires a test that no one else can take for you. I taught you everything I knew about distance because I understood that the hardest distance you would ever cover would not be measured in meters. It would be measured in the space between the person you were and the person you would need to become. You have covered that distance now. The rifle is yours. It has always been yours. Use it to teach the next ones what I taught you, not because the skills matter, though they do, but because the act of teaching is how we prove that what we survived had purpose. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you, and if I could go back and make a different choice, I would not, because the world needed you to do what only you could do, and I needed you to know what you are capable of. Live well. Teach well. Remember that distance is not the enemy. Fear of distance is the enemy, and you have never been afraid of the things that matter. Garrett. She read it twice. The second time, her hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken in the mountains. And she set the letter down and walked outside and stood in the North Carolina morning until the shaking stopped. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father's funeral, and she would not start now. But something in her chest that had been held tight for 6 months and 11 hours and 740 meters loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe all the way down. He had known. He had always known, and he had sent her anyway, not because he did not love her, but because he loved her enough to trust her with the hardest thing he could give, the chance to become who she was always going to be. She went back inside. She put the letter in the case with the rifle, where it would stay, and where she would find it again on mornings when the weight of what she carried felt heavier than it should. The years that followed were good years. She taught at Fort Bragg for 3 years, then at other places whose names do not appear on maps. She deployed twice more. She came home. She was promoted, declined, then accepted when Caldwell, by then a colonel, told her the people coming up needed someone who understood what both hands meant. On her 42nd birthday, a call came from a number she did not recognize. The voice was old, careful, accented. "Miss Morrison, my name is Kasim. I wanted to say I am glad you are alive. The woman by the fire was my sister. We remember you." The line went dead before she could respond. She stood with the phone in her hand for a long time, then went back to the work of selecting the next training cycle. She chose 12. She always chose 12. The number Garrett had taught her was right. Of the 12, 9 graduated. Some went on to do work that mattered in places that needed them. Some became instructors themselves. One died in circumstances that will never be fully explained, but that Kate understood perfectly when she read the report, because she recognized the signature of a choice made under pressure when the correct option looked wrong from outside. She went to the funeral. She did not speak. She stood in the back and watched the family receive the flag, and she thought about distances covered and prices paid, and the quiet, unthanked work of people who go to places where they are not wanted and do things that need doing and come back changed in ways they will never fully explain to anyone who was not there. Years later, when Caldwell died, she went to the funeral and spoke. She told the story of the mountain road, the way he had said, "It wasn't," without turning around, the way he had filed the after-action report, making sure her 11 hours were on record. He saw things clearly, she said, and when he saw something that mattered, he made sure other people saw it too. After the service, 3 people told her that Caldwell had spoken of her often, that he had used the mountain road as the example of what right looked like. She thanked them and drove back to Montana. At 66, she retired to Montana, to a house she had built on land that had belonged to Garrett and that he had left to her in a will that contained only one instruction: use it well. She did. She taught shooting to children whose parents brought them on weekends, not because the children needed to learn to shoot, but because the parents understood that what she was actually teaching was patience and precision and the ability to be alone inside yourself without being lonely, which are skills that matter regardless of whether you ever hold a rifle again. She took one student privately, a girl of 14 whose father had just died and who came to the fence line with nothing in her face. And Kate looked at her and saw herself and understood that the chain was not finished, would never be finished, as long as there were people who needed to learn what distance meant. She placed the Remington 700 in the girl's hands, Garrett's rifle, her rifle. Now this girl's rifle, for as long as it took the girl to understand what it was teaching her. "This is not for killing," Kate said. "This is for understanding distance." The girl did not understand, not yet, but she would. And when she did, she would understand everything else that came after, because distance was always the lesson, and the lesson was always about more than shooting. When the time came, she wrote a letter to the girl at the fence line. She placed it in the case with the rifle and Garrett's letter. This rifle has been in our family for longer than you have been alive. It is not for killing. It is for understanding distance. Use it well. Teach someone else when the time comes. Pass it on. The distance is always reachable. You just have to stop thinking about the distance and start thinking about the next thing you can control. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Kate. She sealed the letter and closed the case. That night, she slept the way she had been sleeping for 50 years, fully, with the particular rest that comes to people who have done their work and know what it cost and have decided the cost was worth it. Years later, they found her in the morning, and they found the letter, and they gave the rifle to the girl, who did not understand yet, but would. And the girl took the rifle to the fence line, and she learned what distance meant. And years later, she taught someone else, and the chain kept going, link after link, carrying forward something that could not be written down, but could be passed on. The work was not finished. The work would never be finished, but the work was good, and the people who did it were good, and the chain held. And that, in the end, was enough.